Dr. ZANETOR, a member of the Committee on Defense and Interior of Ghana's Parliament, is not enthused about the threats of authority of heads of state of ECOWAS to sanction military intervention following the coup in Niger. She said the rippling effects of such intervention may be too expensive for the continent to bear.
The cost of any military intervention, if you weigh very carefully and you look at the factors that can play out, one has to consider, does a military intervention run the risk of destabilizing the sub-region further? In the event that we have an exodus of refugees, does the entire sub-region, or the nation states in the sub-region, have the capacity to absorb these refugees or displaced persons without completely collapsing their economies, given the fact that the economies in the sub-region are generally struggling? Because the issue of internally displaced persons, first of all, and then second of all, refugees, is not something that can be handled as it appears on paper. You know, you have to find the premises, you have to find the resources available, and with countries struggling, in Ghana, for example, if we're currently, receiving support from the IMF, which we know even that support and the World Bank is not going to even get us out of the situation we find ourselves in. And so the consideration of a military intervention goes beyond simply trying to restore the status quo in a particular country, which is a sovereign state, though as part of the ECOWAS.
She also welcomed the stance of the Nigerian Senate in opposing any such military intervention, saying it shows democracy in the sub-region is improving.
This is the beauty of democracy, because you cannot, as the executive, unilaterally decide to take a country to war without the buy-in of the representatives of the people. And so what the Nigerian Senate has proven to the sub-region and proven to all of us is that the executive, which basically is represented by the heads of states and the various in the commission of ECOWAS, cannot do this unilaterally without the buy-in of the various legislative arms in their countries. Because if we are actually talking about constitutional rule and we're talking about democracies, we're talking about the three arms of government. The executive cannot unilaterally take a decision that puts a whole state in a particular, puts a state at war with another. And so I think it's an interesting and a refreshing development in this whole event or series of events, because it shows that there is some kind of evolution happening in our democracy, that we can't just get up and declare war without the buy-in of our people. And this is perhaps akin to what we saw happening with Brexit, where a referendum was held, the people pushed for the exit from the EU, and the representatives who are the members of parliament had no choice but to implement what it was that the masses were looking for. And in like manner, if the Senate of Nigeria has not agreed to a military intervention, what it simply does is it allows a face-saving way out and away from this position of a military intervention and pushes us back to the dialogue, the mediation board.
Dr. ZANETOR believes that more work has to be done to unearth the underlying cause of these coups. As it appears, there is a trend, particularly so when all instabilities are in Francophone countries.
Because you see, none of what we're observing is happening in a vacuum. The reasons may be different based on the different countries, but there is an underlying trigger. There appears to be a common thread. Mind you, all of these are happening in Francophone countries. So there is something that we need to be looking at beyond the obvious. And as ECOWAS, we certainly need to have that discussion, whether it's the issue of the influence with France in their former colonies, whether it's a case of governance, whether it's a case of injustice perceived or real, whether it's a case of corruption. We need to bring everyone to the table to have that real discussion with regards to what the underlying factors are. Because bear in mind that Nigeria itself is grappling with violent extremism and terrorism. which they are struggling to keep in check. And if you couple that with an intervention in another country, understanding that the geopolitics of that particular region, northern Nigeria and that particular area, is quite complicated. There are underlying currents even within the country with regards to the country breaking up. You do not want to create a situation that becomes a catalyst for something that you did not anticipate as part of a problem domestically as you go across the border to deal with something. We need to start looking at what's happening in the sub-region, not as silos happening in the various nation states, but to understand there's a common thread that's happening there. And if it's an issue of the Francophone countries taking a position with regards to France, we need to have that conversation. We can't ignore the elephant in the room any longer.
On whether Ghana should sanction ECOWAS military intervention decision, she cautioned that Ghana would have to consider what is in the national interest, considering the fact that we are surrounded by French-speaking countries.
We have a very interesting situation. We are surrounded by French-speaking countries. To our northern border is Burkina Faso, one of the countries that has declared to take a position in alignment with Niger should there be military intervention. Cooperation between Burkina Faso and Ghana is key to keeping our northern border safe and the northern zone of our country. And so when we are looking at how ECOWAS takes a decision on intervening in another country, we must also consider what is our national interest. No country can be quiet or perhaps ignorant of its own national interest in spite of treaties that it may have signed, international treaties and any other agreements that it may have signed on or assented to. So in all seriousness, rushing into a military intervention may not be the best thing to do, because you may in theory think that this is something that can be done over a particular period of time, maybe 48 hours, 7 days, a month. But when you go into a situation and militarily you discover that the conflict that you've entered into is not as straightforward, it becomes difficult to even determine what's that end point. At which point do you say, we're pulling out? And are you going to leave the place in a worse state than you found it? We have pockets of conflict happening along our northern borders, which make things, which creates a weakness in our architecture. We have to be careful as we start blowing the horn for military intervention that we're not opening ourselves up, because to date, Ghana is the only country in the surrounding area between the three neighboring countries, the only one that has not been hit by any kind of terrorist attack, for whatever reason that is. And perhaps this is not the time to be rattling the cage, because we are really having to deal with a lot of issues north of our border. We've seen a lot of this activity of terrorists also associated with the illegal mining, which we still haven't come to terms with. We have not really handled that situation properly. And specifically, the executive has not handled the issue of illegal mining properly. And there is a direct link between foreign persons engaging in illegal mining in Ghana and perhaps supplying, whatever resources they're getting to other parts of the sub-region. We don't have specifics of what the money is being used for, but your guess is as good as mine. How have we put in place measures here to protect our own national security, our internal security, as we participate in what is being pushed for in Niger? We need to ensure that in going down this path, we're not creating more instability and opening ourselves up to perhaps unnecessary incidents here with regards to any kind of attacks or extremism, crossing into our borders. So is Ghana safe? Maybe for now. But just to add that we have a very large population of Nigerian citizens in Ghana, and whatever decisions that we take, that is something that must be factored into our decision making with regards to what it is that Ghana wants to be a part of when it comes to what's happening in Niger and in the sub-region in general.